Do you ever get into a spot where you're trying to get something done, and you realize that there are so many things that you really need to do, um, that you just can't get one done because there's so many of them that are like now, um, the urgent, the high priority stuff, and you need to drop everything because this thing needs to be done. But the thing that you have to drop to go do that, um, is the thing that next week is going to be the emergency, right? And eventually, maybe you get the emergencies kind of mopped up a little bit, but you've got so many things that you've dropped that now you don't have a plan for any of those. So you need to do something, but you wind up doing nothing because you're overwhelmed. Um, you're either overwhelmed or you've been so stressed from the emergencies that you've been taking care of that you just sit down and don't get up. And, turn on the TV or find something to kind of numb you a little bit. This happens to me a lot. It happens to me at work. It happens to me at home. More often than not, it happens to me at work and at home, so I just can't get away from it. And I find ways to occupy my mind and occupy my time, to help me forget about those things. Because I know eventually one of them will become an emergency, and then I'll have to do it. And that's when I'll get it done. When that thing is an emergency. At work, I know I've got a due date, and I've got all of this stuff I can't possibly get done. But I know that I can keep my due dates, and I'm pretty good at that. So I'm just going to work to my due date. And it's going to be a big, stressful week at the end of the month or the end of the quarter or whatever it's going to be when I get my due date, and hit my due date. Then I can relax a little bit until the next one comes. I'm realizing that that's how I spend a lot of my efforts, a lot of my time. I pay for that. I probably pay for that more at home than I do at work, because at home, a lot of those due dates never come. If you're working on a project, there is no due date. If you're maintaining your car, there really is no due date. The problem at home, if you're raising your kids, there is no due date, right? There's not something on the calendar where you take a look at it and you say, "Oh, here it comes. I got my due date coming up." There may be a few things, but generally the everyday stuff, there is no due date for that stuff like there is at work. Now, I'm successful at work in hitting my due dates, so that works for me. I could do it better, but a lot of things that I do, they have a due date. Sometimes I set that due date. More often than not, someone else sets it for me. Either there's a procedure that says 30 days, so in 30 days you've got to do it, or my boss says we're going to do this quarterly, therefore I've got a due date at the end of the quarter. At home, I don't have that, right? Everything is self-imposed at home. Um, your wife may say, "I'd like to get that done this weekend." Well, that's fine. But if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then you have a due date. And if you have a due date, then but it's not necessarily a due date. So this links back to the priorities video that I put out recently, talking about how you set your priorities, how you figure out what is important here. And I'm thinking out loud, and I'm realizing that part of what I was talking about in that video is setting goals and setting due dates and keeping with them. Those goals that you set for yourself, you're in control. If you choose to set that due date for yourself and then you choose to keep it, you have now set a priority. You've made that thing a priority in your life. I've set a due date to have one of these videos that I can put out every Friday. I've made a couple of Fridays now. It's starting to become a bit of a priority where I'm making a commitment to myself and to you to put this out there. That's starting to be a priority in my life, but it's a self-imposed priority because none of you said, hey, I want this thing. I want you to do this thing, and I want you to have it out there on a Friday, sometime during the day on Friday, so that I can look at it over the weekend and maybe learn something from it, right? It hasn't worked like that. So I'm realizing in my life that at home I struggle with all of that stuff because there is no due date. I take that back. So for a lot of these things, there actually is a due date. Maintaining your car, the thing comes due when you need it and it breaks down and won't go. Now you've got an immediate emergency due date. You don't maintain your furnace, guess what? Below zero outside, boom, due date. No hot water, guess what? Leak in the roof, due date. The thing is due now. It's come due. So there are these priorities that come due, and now you have an emergency. That's when you have your due date. And I find that at home, I work in that area. That's how a lot of my priorities are being set for me right now, is based upon that kind of due date. So I want to change that because there's some other really important due dates that I can't afford to become emergencies, right? Raising my kids, all of the aspect of raising my kids, teaching them, leading them spiritually, getting into the Word of God with my family. I got a teenager. The moments, there's a picture of this clock, and that clock doesn't have a second hand and a minute hand and an hour hand. It has a moment's hand, and the moments are ticking by, and I look at that clock for my teenage daughter, and that thing is spinning off the wall because those moments are flying by, and every day I miss another one. That thing becomes an emergency when she hits a crisis in her life and doesn't have the tools to deal with that crisis, and I'm not there to deal with it for her. Well, now we have an emergency, and I have no influence over making it better at that point. Your crisis of relationship with your spouse, as time goes by and you're not connected, spiritually, emotionally, in your faith, all of these areas, you're not aligned in your priorities. You're not understanding and meeting her needs, and vice versa. When does that become an emergency? When you've drifted apart so far that a fight becomes a talk of divorce or separation, is that when it's an emergency? Or is it an emergency when you identify that we haven't spent the time we need this week to stay connected, to be a team? What's that emergency for you in your relationship? Right now, in my life, it's not where it needs to be. My emergency trigger needs to be in a different spot. But better than that, I need a plan so that I'm not dealing with emergencies, just like maintaining my car, just like taking care of a garden. You don't go out there at the harvest time to figure out how to take care of pulling the weeds and all that. It's too late by then. It's an emergency. And if that garden was going to be your food for the winter, now you have a real emergency. Now you got to figure out something else. Because what would have worked isn't going to work now. And you got to deal with it. So that's that's what I'm thinking about today, is those priorities. It's a continuation of thinking about those priorities, but realizing that those due dates that I have to drive me at work, I'm realizing I don't have those due dates at home. The commitments that I make are the commitments that I make instead of the ones given to me, and I need to take those more seriously. I need to identify those things and reprioritize so that those things are an emergency when they're just starting to drift in the wrong direction. That's an emergency. If you're driving a huge ship and you start to get a little bit off course, that's an emergency, because it takes you miles to get it back on course again. If you're driving a little boat, you just turn the wheel, get back on course. You can wander all over the place and get where you're going to go. We need to identify those things in our life that are big ships that take a long time to turn, and keep those things going in the right direction. Keep them moving and maintained. And identify those things that are smaller, and don't spend so much time on trying to make those things go, because those things can stop and just start up by pulling the cord, and keep it going. So I hope this, I don't have any answers here, right? I'm just identifying some things that I need to take a look at in my life. So I hope that maybe that concept has triggered something in your mind to say, yeah, I need to look at that. I can look at that. Maybe you're, as I'm talking about this is something that has come to you, and you're like, yeah, you got it, buddy. You got it, buddy. If that's you, just pray for me, because you beat me there, and that's great. And if you are living that life, that's encouraging to me. That you've got that right in your relationships, you've got that right in your priorities, and you're living that. So that's encouraging to me. If that's you, if you're where I'm at, I'm praying for you, brother. I'm praying for all of us that we could prioritize and live our lives in a way that's not jumping from one emergency to the next. And those things that are super duper important, our faith, our relationships with our wives and our children and each other, are our priorities. See ya.